Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 35. The topic is Evidence of Evolution. Discussing agenda for the topic is Introduction, Direct Observations of Evolutionary Change, Natural Selection in Response to Introduced Species, the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria, homology, the fossil record, and biogeography. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about various evidences that proves the occurrence of the phenomena of evolution. Evolution is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidences. Darwin in 1859 formulated all his findings and presented his theory of evolution by means of natural selection and supported this theory by a broad range of evidences, yet he himself acknowledged the fact that there were certain cases, there were certain instances where he himself was unable to trace the evolutionary history, as he himself referred to the origin of flowering plants as an abominable mystery. This was another manuscript which Darwin wrote in 1879, exactly 20 years after the publishing of this manuscript. In that particular manuscript, he mentioned the flowering plants where he was unable to trace their evolutionary history because of the absence of fossil record. He lamented the lack of fossils, showing how earlier groups of organisms gave rise to new groups. In the last 150 years, new discoveries have filled many of the gaps that Darwin identified. Courtesy of the advancements in technologies, so many different techniques are employed and which has enabled the researchers to fill the gaps, to find the missing links. The origin of flowering plants, for example, is much better understood, and many fossils have been discovered that signify the origin of new groups of organisms. In this section, we will consider 4 types of data that document the pattern of evolution and illuminate how it occurs. The first one will be direct observation, homology, the fossil record, and biogeography. So the first one is direct observation, natural selection in response to introduced species. This insect is soapberry bug. It feeds upon seeds. The seeds are present within fruit, so the insect uses its beak or its proboscis. It enters its proboscis into the fruit until it reaches the seed, and then it sucks the juice of the seeds. So the size of their proboscis or beak varies with the size of the fruit or with the thickness of the pulp of the fruit. So we have two types of populations of these soapberry bugs. One population that lives in southern Florida. There the soapberry bugs feed on balloon vine with larger fruit. So balloon vine has larger fruit, and this larger fruit has a thick pulp, and the insect needs to have a long proboscis so that it is inserted within that thick pulp and it reaches the seeds. Whereas on the other hand, in the central Florida, the balloon vine has gone rare, so the farmers introduced another plant species from some country, which is gold rain tree, and this introduced species has a fruit which has a thin pulp, thin. So it means that the soapberry bugs which lives there, they can feed on those fruits, on those seeds, even by having small beaks, small proboscis, and that is exactly what has happened. Initially, when the balloon vine was there in central Florida, they too had longer beaks. But when the balloon vine went rare there, the farmers introduced the gold rain tree, which has a small fruit with a thin pulp, and which can be fed with the help of even a small beaker. So the soapberry bugs started to grow smaller beaks. So here we can relate the size of the beak or the proboscis with the size of the fruit or the thickness of the pulp. And these cases are examples of evolution by natural selection. Now it is beneficial for the organisms, for this small insect. Here in this case, they require a longer proboscis, because a shorter proboscis will not reach the site from where the juice can be sucked, and if they have a smaller proboscis, they will not be able to feed in a proper way. So, and here in that case, they can feed on the juice even by having a small proboscis. So there is no need to grow a large proboscis which can entangle with something, and they can conserve the energy for growing or maintaining a large proboscis, and that energy can be utilized in some other activity, some other vital life activity. So this is one of the examples of evolution by natural selection, where both these organisms have adapted themselves according to their environment. Now just imagine if you catch some organisms from that population and leave them here in that population, what will happen? They will either grow longer proboscis or they will become extinct. And similarly, if you pick some or individuals from that population and leave them there, then with the passage of time they will either decrease their proboscis size. So in Florida, this evolution in beak size occurred in less than 35 years. Evolution is a process which takes lot of time, hundreds of thousands of years, and here you can see the process of evolution is on exhibition within 35 years. And the next example we will see where the process of evolution is even faster than that. Direct observation, the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. The bacterium Staphylococcus aureus is commonly found on people's skin or in their nasal passages. Some bacteria are methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus strains, and they are dangerous pathogens. These are resistant to methicillin. They have developed resistance to that particular antibiotic. Staphylococcus aureus became resistant to penicillin in 1945. Penicillin is the first antibiotic which was commercially available, and Staphylococcus aureus bacteria became resistant to them in 1945. 2 years after it was first widely used, means 2 years after the commercial production of penicillin, these bacteria became resistant to it. And once these bacteria became resistant to this particular antibiotic, then the scientists or the microbiologists or the pharmacists, they tried to find other alternatives or other alternatives for bringing an end to these disease-causing agents and for eliminating them. So they developed another type of antibiotic, methicillin. Methicillin was initially effective against Staphylococcus aureus, but after some time, that is 2 years after it was first widely used, they also developed resistance against methicillin. So when exposed to methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus strains are more likely to survive and reproduce than non-resistant Staphylococcus aureus strains. So how methicillin kills bacteria? Methicillin works by inhibiting a protein used by bacteria in their cell walls. So this was the pharmacokinetics of methicillin, but as the bacteria identified this problem in their proximity, they tried to develop another kind of protein or enzyme for that function. As a result, the methicillin was no longer effective against these bacteria. So methicillin resistant strains are now resistant to many types of antibiotics. So we just wind up the direct observations. Natural selection does not create new traits but edits or selects for traits already present in the population. Means the trait, the sucking of juice by the soapberry bug, it was something which was already present in that population of soapberry bugs, so it was modified to a certain extent by evolution. Similarly, bacteria are also living organisms. They do resist against their enemies. They have the enzymes, the restriction enzymes, the CRISPR-Cas9 system, where with the help of which they combat their enemies. So they do have mechanisms to overcome overcome anything which intends to harm their survival. The local environment determines which traits will be selected for or selected against in any specific population. This is also a very important sentence, that it is actually the environment which determines which traits are suitable to the conditions and which traits are not suitable. So now we move on to homology. A second type of evidence for evolution comes from analyzing similarities amongst different organisms. Evolution is a process of descent with modification. Related species can have characteristics with underlying similarity that function differently. So homology is basically the similarities in the structures of related species. There will be anatomical similarities or phenotypic similarities in individuals because of two reasons. That is, either they will have a common ancestor or because of living in the same environment, that is convergent evolution. So similarities resulting from common ancestry is known as homology. The view of evolution as a remodeling process leads to the prediction that closely related species should have similar features, and they do. Of course, closely related species share the features used to determine their relationship, but they also share many other features. Some of these features make little sense except in the context of evolution. Homologous structures are anatomical resemblances that represent variations on a structural theme present in a common ancestor. Here you can see the mammalian forelimbs. The forelimbs are modified into performing different functions. The cat uses it for walking, the humans uses it for picking different types of stuffs. The whale uses it as a flipper for swimming. The bat uses it for flying. So the same structure has been modified in different ways. Comparative embryology reveals anatomical homologies not visible in adult organisms. In majority of the cases, the embryonic development of the organisms, the stages the organisms pass through, are so much similar that it is very difficult to differentiate between the embryos of various groups of organisms. So there are so many similarities, and these similarities in the embryonic stages only points towards their common ancestry. Vestigial structures are remnants of features that served important functions in the organism's ancestors. There are certain structures that are vestigial, and these structures used to perform some functions in the ancestors. For example, the presence of appendix is example of a vestigial structure in humans, although the recent research shows that the appendix do have some kind of a function. Another example is the skeleton of some snakes retains vestiges of the pelvis and leg bones of walking ancestors. Although the snakes crawl, but still they have these appendages of their walking ancestors. Another example is provided by eye remnants that are buried under scale in blind species of cave fishes. Some species of fishes live in caves where they rely on electrocution or olfactory cues, and they do have eye remnants which points towards their ancestry, that probably some of their ancestors do had them. Another example is similarities in the molecular level. The DNA composition, the 4 types of nucleotides, adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, that composes the DNA, the ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell in almost all types of organisms, the glucose breakdown pathway where the glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain occurs. So these are the processes which signify the fact that these organisms have a common ancestry. Another example is the genetic code, which is universal. Now here you can see the similarities between a human embryo and a chick embryo, post-anal tail and the pharyngeal arches. So what it shows a common ancestry. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that the similarities in the phenotype or the anatomical features or the embryonic development of two individuals may be because of having a common ancestor, or in some instances they may be because of convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is one of the patrons of evolution. It is a process in which two individuals, two species that are not related genetically, they develop similar features because of living in the same environment as an adaptation. So convergent evolution is the evolution of similar or analogous features in distantly related groups, means they develop similar phenotypes although they have a distant common ancestor. Analogous traits arise when groups independently adopt in similar environments in similar ways. Convergent evolution does not provide information about ancestry. The third type of evidence of evolution is the fossil record. Fossil record documents the pattern of evolution, showing the past organisms differed from present-day organisms and that many species have become extinct. Fossils also show the evolutionary changes that have occurred in various groups of organisms. To give one of hundreds of possible examples, researchers found that over several thousand years, the pelvic bone or in fossil stickleback fish become greatly reduced in size. The consistent nature of this change over time suggests that the reduction in the size of the pelvic bone may have been driven by natural selection. So the process of evolution is a slow process, it's a gradual process, it's a process which is directed by natural selection, as the organism tends to develop features that enables it to live successfully under the prevailing environmental conditions. So the fossils can also shed light on the origin of new groups of organisms. The fossils provides a way to look into the past. An example is the fossil record of cetaceans. Cetacean is a group of aquatic mammals, the mammalian order that includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Some of these fossils provide strong support for a hypothesis based on DNA sequence data. Now, because of the advancements in molecular biology, DNA sequences are used, bioinformatic tools are used, and the similarity in the DNA sequences are used to establish the evolutionary relationship between different groups of organisms. So, courtesy of these techniques, the researchers have established the relationship that cetaceans are closely related to even-toed ungulates. Ungulates is a group that includes hippopotamus, pigs, deer, and cows. What else can fossil tell us about cetacean origins? The earliest cetaceans lived 50 to 60 million years ago. So this is the ankle bone in mammals. This one is in cetaceans, and you can see its resemblance with the one in ungulates. The fossil record indicates that prior to that time, most mammals were terrestrial. Although scientists had long realized that whales and other cetaceans originated from land mammals, few fossils had been found that revealed how cetacean limb structure had changed over time, leading eventually to the loss of hind limbs and the development of flukes and flippers. So here is another opinion that the cetaceans have evolved from a terrestrial mammalian ancestor, and the evidence is that with the passage of time, those cetaceans or those terrestrial ancestors started to lose their hind limbs, and the decrease in structure of the hind limb occurred with the passage of time, and eventually the hind limb disappeared, whereas the forelimb developed into flippers and flukes. In the past few decades, however, a series of remarkable fossils have been discovered in Pakistan, Egypt, and North America. These fossils document steps in the transition from life on land to life in sea, filling in some of the gaps between ancestral and living cetaceans. Now, this is an interesting statement because if you look at the evolution of life, then we say that the life originated in the oceans and then migrated to land, and here we see that the cetaceans or the mammals, they were their ancestors were terrestrial, so means the life once moved from oceans to land and then the from land to ocean. So here you can see the transition where different stages are shown, how a cetacean evolved from a terrestrial mammalian ancestor. What happened? You can see that regression or decrease occurred in the size of the pelvis and hind limbs, and eventually the pelvis and hind limb bone just disappeared, and the forelimb developed into a flipper. So this is the course of evolution where an organ disappeared or modified into performing other function, and this is the time frame in millions of years. So the living cetaceans, they had a common ancestor with the even-toed ungulates about we can say about 55 to 56 million years ago. Collectively, the recent fossil discoveries document the origin of a group of mammals, the cetaceans. These discoveries also show that cetaceans and their close living relatives are much more different from each other than were Pachycetus and early even-toed ungulates such as Diacodexis. Biogeography. A fourth type of evidence for evolution comes from the field of biogeography, the scientific study of the geographic distribution of species. The geographic distribution of organisms are influenced by many factors, including continental drift. Continental drift is the slow movement of Earth's continents over time. About 250 million years ago, the movements united all of Earth's land masses into a single large continent called Pangaea, just like the icebergs float on the surface of water. So the land, the pieces of land, as you know that the 70% surface of the earth is covered by water, whereas 30% is land. So these pieces of land also floated like the pieces of iceberg on water, and about 250 million years ago all the pieces, they combined with each other and formed a single mass which was called Pangaea. Roughly 200 million years ago, the Pangaea began to break apart. By 2 million years ago, the continents we know today were within a few hundred kilometers of their present location. So we can use our understanding of evolution and continental drift to predict where fossils of different groups of organisms might be found. So once upon a time, all the continents they were together into a single piece of land, and then they started to separate from each other. For example, scientists have constructed evolutionary trees for horses based on anatomical data. These trees and the ages of fossils of horses ancestors suggest that the genus that includes present day Equus originated 5 million years ago in North America. Geologic evidence indicates that at that time North America and South America were not yet connected, making it difficult for horses to travel between them. Thus, we would predict that the oldest Equus fossil should be found only on the continent on which the group originated, that is, North America. This prediction and others like it for different groups of organisms have been upheld, providing more evidence for evolution. So, how biogeography provides an evidence to evolution? The Equus horses evolved in North America 5 million years ago, and the North and South America separated from each other 20 million years ago. So, the fossils of this ancient Equus horse can only be found in North America and not in South America. Similarly, Darwin, on his visit to the Galapagos Island, observed the similarities between the organisms of various islands on the Galapagos and between the animals and the fossils found on the Galapagos and the South American mainland, and these organisms were not found anywhere else, and they were different from other organisms found in other areas. So yet Darwin described in the origin of species, most island species are closely related to species from the nearest mainland, that is the species found on the Galapagos Island showed similarities with the ones on the South American mainland. He explained his observations by suggesting that islands are colonized by species from the nearest mainland. Such a process also explains why two islands with similar environments in distant parts of the world tend to be populated not by species that are closely related to each other, but rather by species related to those of the nearest mainland, where the environment is often quite different. So it also explains that at times two areas which are wide apart from each other, they are, although they have similar conditions, similar environments, but they have different species. So what is the reason for that? The reason is because these areas or these islands have different species residing on the adjoining mainlands, and because the species residing on the mainlands from time to time migrate to the islands, therefore the species on the island tends to look more similar to the ones on the mainland. So this was the end of the lecture. I hope it was beneficial for all of you. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.